We found that a high proportion of farmers, over 50% of them that saw a lame sheep reported it treated within a week. What we did find from analysis is that we found that farmers that delayed treatment actually were more likely to have cod on their farm. When you delay treatment, say, of scald, it can actually spread to their lambs, or it can actually, of scald or foot rot, it can actually fester into something like a more severe form of foot rot, or where cod is present on your farm, it can actually progress to cod. So the longer you leave the lameness condition, the more severe it can get. Also, the harder it can get to treat, and the more intensive the treatment you have to administer. So it can actually take the farmer longer to actually treat it successfully, if they can treat it at all.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch, and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice, and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode, we catch up with postgraduate student Jake Delaney to discuss some of the key results from a survey collected last year looking at ovine lameness in Ireland and some of the farmer management practices. Jake gives us a bit of background to the survey. We discuss the type and level of lameness reported, and in particular the increased levels of cod. Jake talks about correct identification and the impact that can have on control, and we discuss management practices on farm to reduce lameness, prompt treatment, culling repeat offenders, and quarantine practices. We finish up with Jake summarising some of the key findings and some of the ongoing work in the area. Maybe just for our listeners, you might give me a quick recap of what that survey was and how you went about collecting the data in it.
Last January, the survey was launched. So if people remember, some people might have filled it out there listening to the podcast. What it was we were asking farmers to report the types of lameness they were seeing in farms. So we know very little about lameness in an Irish context, especially infectious lameness, so the three types: scald, foot rot, and cod. So what the survey was looking to do was kind of quantify, put a few numbers in some of these things, like what was the number of lame sheep farmers were seeing on the farm per year, what were the type of cases farmers were seeing on the farm every year, what was the type of disease. So we also asked farmers whether they were able to identify types of lameness from images that we had in the survey, and as well we asked them what treatment methods they were using to treat the different diseases they were seeing, or what prevention methods they were using to prevent those cases or even control them on their farm. So a range of questions as well. Along with that, we were asking farmers about their biosecurity measures they were implementing on farm, and as well what their foot batting facilities and procedures were like.
So Jake, you give a great baseline for you to actually look at what are the issues, what's the level of lameness out there, and the latter aspect of that in terms of the management and the control of lameness on farms really did give you a great insight to what's happening. I suppose, to be fair, Jake, we have to thank a lot of farmers that did participate in this, because there was quite a few questions. It was quite comprehensive.
Yeah, it was. It was a long survey, but thankfully we got some great results out of it, and a great response from the farmers that participated. In terms of where we collected the surveys, we collected them online, and we collected them at things like Teagasc Sheep conferences and farm open days as well.
And look, it has to be said, it's broadly representative. I think you told me before, we have nearly 250 respondents. That's only the lowland section alone.
Yeah. So for the lowland section, we've about 248 respondents, all kind of coming from varying backgrounds. We have some people with some large flocks and some people with on the smaller end of flock size as well. So for our average flock size of farmers that responded to the survey, with 187 ewes was the average flock number there. And in terms of farm size, the average farmer that responded to the survey was 51. It's a farm size of 51 hectares.
So look, it's very representative of what's out there in the industry. So if we get down to the nuts and bolts of it at the moment, in terms of identifying lameness, so this is always one of the challenges. Maybe we're still of the opinion it's probably under-detected within flocks. We're kind of blind to it, but what kind of levels of lameness was reported by the farmers who completed the survey?
So when we asked farmers, we asked them two different measures of lameness. So we asked them first to give an average kind of round figure for throughout the year. So if they were to walk out into the field in the morning, how many sheep would they see lame at that one period of time? So what we got there was farmers reported an average of 8.9% of a mean kind of average yearly lameness estimate. But when we broke that down then, so after the farmer was showing a picture of cod, foot rot, or scald, they were then asked to see, when they were treating that, if they were treating lame sheep on their farm, how many cases of that condition would they see between lame and unlame sheep?
We have that general figure throughout the year. In terms of the causes, like you mentioned some conditions, what were they identifying as the main causes of lameness? And maybe take that a step further. How accurate were they in identifying those causes?
Yeah, so what we saw, Kieran, was the highest burden, say, on farms that was reported by farmers was scald, coming in at about 9%. Farmers were reporting a prevalence of 9% scald within their flock. Then followed by cod, 6.6% for farmers that had cod in the farm, and then followed by foot rot, 6.4%.
That's quite an increase, particularly in cod. It's quite an increase. We would assume the first two would have been the most prevalent. How accurate was that being identified? Like your pictorial examples of it give you a bit of a quantifier on that one.
Yeah, so we asked farmers two questions on that one, whether they could correctly identify it and had they seen it on farm. So what we saw there was about 80% of farmers could correctly identify scald, foot rot. About 65% of farmers could correctly identify cod. But we asked a follow-up question to that. We then asked, had they seen the condition on farm before? And this is where we got some very interesting results. So over 90% of farmers had seen the case of scald on their farm before. Over 85% of farmers had seen cases of foot rot. But when we came to cod is when we got some really interesting results. So originally we thought cod wasn't in that high of a level in Irish flocks. We didn't think there was a high level in Irish flocks, so that many Irish flocks had cod. What we found from the survey and some stuff we're seeing on our farm visits as well is that cod is, from the report of the survey, present in approximately over 45% of flocks.
And that's quite stark contrast to what we it's what we would have thought was at a lower level. Even some of the previous reports would have put a lower level, but evidently it's far more common than we would have assumed. Yeah,
so it's there, Kieran, and say our neighbours in the UK have cod levels of over 50% in their flocks. Kind of it's bearing true for an Irish context as well, that we're seeing the amount of cod in our flocks. So it's a relatively new thing. They first identified it in the UK in kind of the 70s and 80s. Kind of was the first case that was reported here in the early 2000s, and since then it's kind of spread through flocks.
Look, that's something I'm sure we'll come back to later on. But just like we're talking about identifying the causes, I know you've asked some questions around this too. Like correct identification, Jake, is key as opposed to our treatment control options afterwards. But how are they going about identifying some of these cases on farms?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions we asked. And what we found was 85% of farmers were turning over lame sheep to identify the cause, to see the disease they were dealing with, see how best to treat it. It's arguably one of the most important things farmers can do on farm is actually turn over a ewe and inspect the hoof, turn over the lamb, inspect the hoof, and see what the cause of lameness is. Because every different lameness condition, if it's scald, foot rot, cod, all have a slightly different treatment protocol, even treatment and prevention protocol. So say in a case of scald where foot backing can be quite effective to treat it, or even a topical antibiotic, it's very different to foot rot or cod where antibiotic injection is required, and especially in the case of cod where foot backing isn't as effective to control it, but is a key measure, say, to prevent it in the flock.
And of course there could be more than one condition present.
Exactly, yeah. So within the flock, flocks could be dealing with many different problems. They could be dealing with a scald issue and a cod issue, or indeed some of the non-infectious types of lameness like toe granulomas or white line abscesses. So it's very important to identify the cause. And if it's causing a problem on your farm, seek veterinary advice.
Look, I suppose one other interesting things on the survey, I know, look, we're only getting a snapshot of it here with you, but like in terms of the management practices on farms, you had a lot of questions in that general area. We might delve into them a little bit more. Like in terms of trying to reduce the burden of lameness on farm or avoid the burden of lameness in sheep, what are the couple of key findings from the survey in that area? Like how are they going about keeping lameness at bay?
Yeah, so what we found here is we might start in a few points in foot batting maybe. We found about 20% of respondents never foot batted their sheep. Now, foot batting can be a key, say, control point when you're gathering your sheep. When you gather your sheep, you're given rise to opportunity for the bacteria that's on their hooves, it's on the sheep that's a disease or has a condition like infectious lameness that's on its hoof. You're given opportunity for that to spread. And when they're gathered in something like a collection yard, that's the perfect grounds for it. It loves that. It loves to jump from hoof to hoof. And then it can spark in the sheep's hoof and cause that infection. So when you pass your sheep out through a foot bath after handling them, it can provide you with a key opportunity to disinfect those hooves and counteract some of that bacteria that's spread during handling. So it can actually be a key control point for controlling lameness within your flock. Especially, say, we know foot batting is effective for the control of scald, and it can help prevent scald in the flock which can help prevent the cause of other diseases or the occurrence of other diseases within the flock. What we found as well, where 51% or over 50% of respondents still reported to trimming the feet of sheep. So what we know with trimming, and something we've discussed kind of a good bit before, is the use of actually foot trimming on farm can do two things. When it's used to, when farmers are trimming the feet of sheep that have some kind of infectious lameness disease like foot rot, cod or scald, it can actually slow down the healing time and take the sheep longer to recover. And secondly, when farmers are using whole flock foot trimming, we know in past experience and some past research that was done that those farms can actually experience higher lameness rates on farm because the process of actually turning over sheep and trimming their feet that aren't lame can actually lead to the spread of conditions.
It's quite surprising how that's still at such a high level. As you mentioned, foot rot can be a control point, but I suppose it's also codependent on good practice. You asked some questions around foot batting practices as well. What did you find?
Yeah, so we found that about 40% of farmers were unsure the concentration they were making up their foot bat to. So it's very important when you're using the different foot batting solutions like zinc sulfate, copper sulfate, or formalin that you're actually aware of what concentration you're making it up to. So what's advised for copper and zinc sulfate is about 10%. And at a lower concentration, or if farmers don't know the dilution rate of that, or in fact the foot bat has been diluted by rainwater, that solution can be far less, the concentration, and it might be effective. On the other side of that, we know that when solutions like formalin are used at too high of a concentration, that ideally being about 3%, that can lead to other issues such as toe granulomas or other infections like white line abscesses. So it's very important to be able to assess the concentration your foot bat is at. Now, we don't recommend the use of formalin due to its carcinogenic properties, and it can actually be quite painful for a lame sheep to walk through and cause a welfare impact as well.
I suppose the other aspect of that, Jake, is what happens after the foot bat, and that's something that's going to be a bit of an issue.
Yeah, so it's very important that after foot bat, the sheep get a proper standing time on a hard, dry surface like concrete, gravel, that allows for the solution to actually soak properly into the foot. So ideally, we're talking about here from half an hour to an hour. So if the sheep don't get that standing time and say they're released straight back into the field, it can some of the solution that's on the hoof that's still yet to penetrate, that will, if it's left in a hard surface, can actually be wiped off, and the solution mightn't be as effective. So you're actually doing yourself a disservice by not giving sheep a proper standing time.
Look, I think that's important. It gives us something to kind of work towards as well when we're talking about control strategies. We talked a lot about identifying the causes earlier. One of the other key issues has to be how prompt we treat these conditions and how we go about treating them. What did you find in that aspect of the survey? Yeah,
so we found that a high proportion of farmers, over 50% of them, that saw a lame sheep reported to treatment within a week. What we did find from analysis is that we found that farmers that delayed treatment actually were more likely to have cod on their farm. So the thing about delaying treatment is when you delay treatment, say, of scald, it can actually spread to other lambs, or it can actually, or scald or foot rot, it can actually fester into something like a more severe form of foot rot, or where cod is present on your farm, it can actually progress to cod. So the longer you leave the lameness condition, the more severe it can get. Also, the harder it can get to treat, and the more intensive a treatment you have to administer. So it can actually take the farmer longer to actually treat it successfully, or if they can treat it at all.
Jake, when we're talking about this, one of the other things we'll always end up talking about when we're looking at lameness to put a plan in place on farms is culling repeat offenders. Now, I suppose there's two sides to that. One, we can say we'll just cull every lame sheep, and that's not the answer either. We'll end up very few sheep in certain cases, particularly in a problem flock. But on the flip of that, there is repeat offenders. I'm sure it's something you've seen in some of the other work you're doing as well. What was the consensus from the survey around culling sheep for lameness?
Yeah, so Kieran, we saw that just over 20% of farmers said they were kind of unlikely or they'd never cull a sheep due to lameness. Now, as you said quite right, in a farm where lameness is a bad problem, or it's in a high proportion of the flock, culling isn't the answer. But when you've got your lameness figure down to about the 5% marker, you've achieved kind of a persistent level of lameness within the flock for this last season or two. Culling can be the answer. Now, what's kind of recommended with culling is what's called a two-strike rule. So If you've treated a sheep successfully and the sheep then becomes lame again within that season, that's and you've treated it again and it's remained lame, or in fact it's cured and gone on then to become lame again, that sheep could be a benchmarker for culling. We see the sheep that are persistently lame within our flock can act as disease wells and end up spreading the disease from sheep to sheep. And what we've seen as well on farms, there's a high proportion from our farm visits. There's a high proportion of sheep that can remain lame on the farm if they're not re-examined. So that comes to the point of establishing a lame group on your farm post weaning. So it can actually be a really effective way of going in, separating off those lame sheep into a paddock near the handling yard where you can get them back in easily 3 or 4 days after they've been treated, re-examine them and see what needs to be retreated. And farmers will find that vastly improves their cure rates that they're achieving on farm, and even helps them identify those persistent offenders that can be doing harm to the flock by acting as a spreading agent for lameness.
I think that's an extremely important point. It's one that cannot be estimated either in terms of its impact. It's a very basic thing to do, but it's maybe something that doesn't happen enough either. Look, one other thing that comes into my mind, we see a lot of animals moving from farm to farm at the moment, whether it be breeding females, rams, store lambs, and we'll talk frequently about it. Many aspects to help us quarantine. And I'm thinking here in terms of the story you told me earlier about cod, how that has spread from being a minimal issue on Irish farms to now being having a high prevalence, and certainly higher than we would have expected. In terms of practices around quarantine, Jake, what did you find from the survey?
Yeah, so we found a high proportion of the farmers, the Irish farmers, were actually buying in, as you'd expect, replacement females or store lambs every year. And especially, this is a good time of the year to be talking about this. This is probably the time that a lot of farmers are going out buying the replacement Joes. But what we found was that farms that were purchasing replacement Joes or store lambs every season were more likely to have cod on the farm. Now, there can be a couple of points to this. So in terms of quarantine, it's important that the sheep are isolated first when they're initially purchased, because you can't see what bacteria is on their hoof. You're unaware of kind of the types of lameness they're carrying. Now, the types of lameness they're carrying initially when they first come into the flock can be very different to the type of lameness they have in a month or two. As I said earlier, it can take cod some time to progress in sheep. So by isolating them for the proper period, quarantining them in a separate paddock for a month or more, you can actually let those lesions develop. You can see what they have, and you can treat any lameness case that comes apparent, and get an idea what you're dealing with on that front. If you don't have cod in your farm, it's not present in your farm, it's not something that could just appear. It's something that has to be imported onto your farm, or something that has to be brought in. So look, in every ideal situation is a closed flock, but that's not practical everywhere. So it's really important to establish proper quarantine procedures when you're buying in replacement Joes or store lambs, so that you can stop any of this from coming into your flock. Because when cod first comes into a flock, it can have quite a devastating consequence. We've seen some cases being reported in the UK and beyond that when cod first comes into a flock, that quickly spread up to 40% of the O's. And it's not just cod either we're talking about here, and from a quarantine point of view when we're talking about lameness, it's bringing in a potentially different type of foot rot onto your farm as well, that can quickly spread your O's that your O's are naive to.
Unfortunately, Jake, like all this, and it is important at this time you were talking about, because all this comes at a time where you might necessarily detect it, or it might be at a very low level that we pass no remarks to. And all of a sudden, a mixture of breeding flock, and it just spreads rapidly. A housing period is coming up now in a couple of months' time. It's the perfect time for this to really take off. Yeah,
it is. And like my advice would be to make the best for the present. When lambs are gone away from Ewes, you can easily isolate lame lambs, or indeed if we're preparing for breeding, lame Ewes, and make sure they're correct before they go to the ram, or indeed before they go into the shed, because lameness loves this kind of to spread in this damp conditions, and especially when they're housed, it provides an ample opportunity. So trying to have the least proportion of your Ewes lame before mating, or indeed before they go into the shed, is kind of set you up ideally for the following year.
Jake, I suppose like we're talking about preparing and preventative measures in terms of vaccination, and I'm thinking more here in the case of foot rot. What level of vaccination was reported on farms?
Yes, we saw about 16% of farmers vaccinating here. Vaccinating against foot rot.
So, Jake, that was really another tool just to combat it on a lot of them farms.
Yeah, so it's a tool. It's included in the 5-point plan that was developed a couple of years ago, and that has been used. And it's certainly another tool in the arsenal that farmers can use, especially if they're dealing with frequently elevated lameness levels in farm.
Jake, if I maybe stand back and look at this, I suppose there are a couple of things that kind of stood out for me just listening to you on this, but probably, I suppose, firstly, like the level of lameness, the prevalence that's acknowledged at farm level. We often say we're lameness blind, but the level that you're reporting there is higher than what we needed as a target.
Yeah, so when they're talking about lameness in a UK context, they're talking about trying to achieve a figure in a flock of 2% or less. So that's 2 sheep per 100 lame or less. Now, it's kind of hard to establish a baseline figure in Ireland because we're actually unsure the levels of lameness within flocks, or the types of lameness within flocks. That's why we started the survey. But kind of what we can aim for is a figure of 5% or less in our flocks. And if farmers are constantly struggling with that, getting advice from your vet or your farm advisor can help there to just set an animal health plan in place and try to get it on top of it.
I think one of the other key standouts to me was that increasing level of cod that's now present seemingly in vast majority of farms out there.
Yeah, it is, and it's kind of a scary thing. We didn't think it was in as many Irish farms, but like cod can be controlled. It's not something that farmers should resign themselves to having or resign themselves to having or give up on. It can be with the right treatment method. It can be cured, and it can be gotten on top of, and it can be prevented. And so it can be something that can be controlled at flock level and controlled quite well.
And perhaps maybe for a final one, like one of the things that did strike me, and you mentioned this pretty much from the start to the finish, but it just struck me that some of the basic practices, whether it be correct treatment, prompt treatment, whether it be basic segregation, correct use of foot baths, that can all have a big impact. But it's sometimes just doing them basic things, Jake, that maybe aren't happening at a sufficient standard or farm level. They can help reduce the amount of lameness we're seeing.
Yeah, it's kind of all about getting the simple things right from getting the concentration of your foot bath right, being able to pass your sheep through the foot bath and exit from the handling yard, and being able to give them that proper standing time. So when we're talking about the likes of zinc or copper sulfate, they actually require a standing time more than a walkthrough. So what they require is a standing time about 15 or 20 minutes, and that's where something like a batch foot bath can come into play. Now, when we're talking about farmland, we're just talking about a walkthrough or a run through. But in the likes of copper or zinc sulfate is when we're talking about the standing time. It's where a batch foot bath can really come into play in order to get the proper standing time and the proper standoff time. But apart from that, things like being able to treat sheep promptly, being set up, have the proper handling facilities in place to be able to treat sheep promptly, and actually know what you're dealing with on farm, so that you can identify it and that you can know what you're treating and you can tailor the treatment to that. And as well, if you're struggling with lameness, one of the key points is to get advice, if it's from your advisor or your vet, and you can actually really help get on top of the lameness you're experiencing on farm.
Jake, look, I think it's an interesting survey. It was certainly interesting hearing some of the key findings from. I'm sure anyone that has completed it will be glad to hear that work has been pulled together now. Look, I know you're involved in a lot of other work on farm at the moment. Certainly something hopefully we'll get you back to talk a bit more about, but there's a good team is there looking at it at this stage. Yeah,
there is, Kieran, and we have a few other things going on the farm. From at the minute, we're out on farms trying to assess the impact that lameness has on ewes and lambs. So if it's lambs from daily gain, say, or from ewes, if it's their body condition score, yeah. But there's a big team of us, and I'd just like to thank Frank Campion and Athenry, Emma Kelly in UCD, and then Joe Angel in Warren Vets in the UK for all their help. And hopefully now we'll be able to get back on with you shortly and share some more results with you.
No, I'll definitely pencil in. So I'll try not leave as long an interval between the last one and the next one so well. But listen, I appreciate you coming on today, Jake. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thanks many, Kieran.
We'll leave it there for this episode. Some very interesting findings from Jake's survey, and it really highlights some of the basic practices that can be implemented at farm level as well to reduce the level of lameness. We'll definitely get him back on again to discuss some of the further work he's ongoing on farms, and I think some really interesting findings coming from that as well. That's it for me. Update Summer Sheep Programme. Keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.